It rolled through fields like thunder made metal. 40 tons of steel that shrugged off shells designed to crack fortresses. The Wehrmacht called it the Green Devil. Panzer crews who survived encounters whispered its name in bunkers with the reverence reserved for nightmares. Over 6,000 were forged in factories that never stopped burning coal, and each one carried a secret that would rewrite the rules of armored warfare. What made this machine so feared that German high command issued orders to retreat rather than engage? Why did hardened tankers abandon their posts at the mere sound of its engine? Stay with us, because what you're about to discover changes everything you thought you knew about World War II tank combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kursk, July 1943. The steppe stretched endlessly under a sky choked with smoke and dust. German formations advanced in precise columns, their Tigers and Panthers leading the spearhead of what Berlin promised would be the decisive blow against the Soviet Union. These machines represented the pinnacle of German engineering, with armor so thick and guns so powerful that they had earned legendary status among both friend and foe. Crews climbed into their steel fortresses confident that nothing the Soviets fielded could match them in open combat. The intelligence reports had been clear. Soviet armor was inferior, their tactics predictable, their crews poorly trained. Victory was not a question, it was a mathematical certainty. Then the horizon erupted. From concealed positions dug into the earth itself, shapes emerged that defied every assumption German commanders had made. Low-slung hulls painted in olive drab surged forward, tracks chewing through grass and mud with mechanical fury. Their silhouettes were wrong, alien, nothing like the boxy T-34s or the lumbering KV series tanks that German gunners had learned to recognize. These newcomers moved with frightening speed, their engines producing a distinctive growl that would soon become synonymous with dread. Turrets swiveled with hydraulic precision, and when their guns spoke, the sound was different. Deeper, more violent. The first German Panzer exploded before its crew realized they were under fire. What had just entered the battlefield was the M4-A2 Sherman, but not the version American forces would deploy across France and Italy. This was a beast modified for the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front, equipped with the diesel engine the Soviets demanded, fitted with wider tracks for traversing the endless mud of the Rasputitsa, and crewed by men who had survived the hell of Stalingrad and learned that survival meant aggression. These tanks arrived through a supply chain that stretched across oceans, delivered under a program that would see over 4,000 Shermans transferred to Soviet forces. But the machine itself was only half the story. What made it unstoppable was not just its design, but the tactical revolution it enabled and the desperation of the enemy it faced. The German panzer forces had spent 3 years conquering Europe with a doctrine built on speed, concentration, and technological superiority. The Blitzkrieg swept through Poland in weeks, crushed France in 40 days, and carved deep into Soviet territory with such ferocity that Moscow itself seemed doomed. German tanks like the Panzer III and IV were reliable, well-armored for their time, and supported by combined arms tactics that had proven devastatingly effective. But by 1943, the calculus had shifted. The Eastern Front devoured machines faster than factories could replace them. Supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. Winter and mud immobilized entire divisions, and now the Soviets were fielding tanks that arrived in numbers Germany could not match, equipped with features German industry could barely comprehend. The Sherman that rolled into Soviet service was an engineering marvel born from
American industrial might. Its designers had prioritized not perfection, but production. Every component was standardized, every system designed for maintenance under combat conditions, every part interchangeable across thousands of identical machines. The hull was welded rather than riveted, making it stronger and faster to manufacture. The suspension used a vertical volute spring system that provided stability across rough terrain while remaining simple enough that field mechanics could repair it with basic tools. The turret rotated on a powered traverse system, allowing the gunner to track moving targets with a speed manual systems could never match. Inside, the crew compartment was spacious compared to cramped German designs, with escape hatches positioned to give every man a chance to survive if the tank was hit. But the true innovation lay in what American engineers called the wet stowage system. Early Shermans had earned a grim reputation among their own crews, nicknamed Ronsons after a lighter brand because they ignited so easily when penetrated. Ammunition stored in the hull would detonate from a single hit, turning the tank into a crematorium. American engineers responded by surrounding ammunition racks with water-filled jackets that absorbed heat and prevented sympathetic detonation. Soviet crews who transferred from T-34s to Shermans noticed the difference immediately. A hit that would have killed everyone in a T-34 might leave a Sherman crew bruised but alive. This was not invincibility, but it was something precious in the grinding arithmetic of armored combat. It was a second chance. The diesel variant shipped to the Soviet Union carried another advantage. Soviet logistics were already built around diesel fuel for their own tanks, trucks, and tractors. Gasoline, which powered most American Shermans, was scarce and volatile on the Eastern Front. The diesel engine reduced the risk of fuel fires and ensured that Soviet supply officers could keep these foreign machines running without restructuring their entire logistics network. The engine itself produced less horsepower than the gasoline variant, but Soviet tankers were accustomed to the T-34's own diesel power plant and adapted quickly. What they valued most was reliability. German tanks might boast superior optics and thicker armor, but they also broke down with frustrating regularity. Transmissions failed, final drives shattered, engine fires erupted from overstressed components. The Sherman, by contrast, simply worked. It started in sub-zero temperatures. It ran for hundreds of kilometers without mechanical failure. It could be repaired by crews who had never seen an American training manual. The gun mounted in the Sherman's turret was the 75mm M3, a weapon that had proven adequate against German armor in North Africa, but was rapidly becoming obsolete by 1943 standards. The frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther could shrug off 75mm shells at combat ranges, forcing Sherman crews to maneuver for side shots or rely on numerical superiority. Soviet crews were not pleased with this limitation. They had grown accustomed to the T-34's 76mm gun, which had better penetration characteristics, and some units requested modifications. Yet despite this drawback, the Sherman brought capabilities that offset its mediocre gun. The powered turret traverse allowed Soviet gunners to engage targets faster than German manual systems. The gyroscopic stabilizer, a feature absent from most tanks of the era, allowed firing on the move with reasonable accuracy. And the gun depression, the ability to angle the barrel downward, meant the Sherman could fight effectively from hull-down positions behind ridges and berms, something Soviet tanks with their limited gun depression struggled to achieve. By the summer of 1943, these machines began arriving at Soviet tank units in quantities that mattered. Trains rolled into depots behind the front lines, their flat cars laden with olive-drab hulls marked with red stars, hastily painted over American insignia. Crews gathered around these foreign machines with a mixture of...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Curiosity and skepticism. They had heard rumors. American tanks were too tall, making them easy targets. The armor was too thin. The gun was inadequate. But as the crews climbed inside and felt the spaciousness of the fighting compartment, examined the quality of the optics, tested the smooth rotation of the turret, and listened to the steady rumble of the diesel engine, opinions began to shift. This was not a Soviet tank. It was something else entirely. And in the hands of men who had survived the crucible of the Eastern Front, it would become a weapon that German forces learned to fear. The doctrine that governed Soviet armored warfare in 1943 was brutal in its simplicity. Tanks were not precious assets to be conserved, but instruments of offensive momentum to be expended in pursuit of breakthrough.
Soviet commanders had watched German blitzkrieg tactics with analytical coldness and had distilled from them a philosophy even more ruthless. Concentrate armor at the point of attack. Overwhelm defenses with speed and mass. Accept catastrophic losses if the breakthrough succeeds. This was not the measured, combined arms approach favored by Western armies. This was armored warfare as a bludgeon, and the Sherman's arrival gave Soviet forces a tool perfectly suited to this philosophy. The first large-scale deployment came during the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored engagement in history. German forces launched Operation Citadel with the goal of encircling and destroying Soviet forces in a massive pincer movement. The northern and southern pincers would converge, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and erasing the salient that bulged into German-held territory. It was an ambitious plan supported by the finest equipment Germany could field. Tigers and Panthers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, and Panzer IVs equipped with long-barreled 75mm guns rolled forward in formations designed to smash through any defense. German commanders expected losses, but believed their superior equipment and training would carry the day. Soviet intelligence had known about Citadel for months. Spies, signals intercept, and aerial reconnaissance provided enough information for Soviet high command to prepare a defense in depth that would absorb the German assault. Minefields stretched for kilometers. Anti-tank guns were dug into camouflaged positions. Infantry prepared strongpoints designed to channel German armor into kill zones. And behind this defensive crust waited the mobile reserves. Tank Corps held back for the decisive counterattack. Among these reserves were the newly arrived Shermans, their crews hastily trained, but eager to prove the worth of their American machines. When the German assault began on July 5th, the opening exchanges were apocalyptic. Minefields tore tracks from advancing panzers. Anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions, their shells slamming into side armor. German forces pushed forward regardless, accepting losses, grinding through the first defensive line and then the second. Soviet infantry fought with suicidal determination, holding positions until they were overrun and then emerging from hidden bunkers to attack German supply columns. The landscape became a moonscape of craters and burning wrecks. And then, as German spearheads began to lose momentum, exhausted by days of continuous combat and stretching their supply lines to the breaking point, Soviet armored reserves surged forward. The Shermans came in waves, not alone but intermixed with T-34s and heavier KV-85s, a tidal surge of steel designed not to duel German tanks at range, but to close the distance and overwhelm through numbers and aggression. German gunners who spotted the approaching formation initially dismissed the unfamiliar silhouettes as more T-34 variants. The recognition came too late. Shermans moved faster than the heavily armored KVs, their suspensions absorbing the rough terrain while maintaining speed. Their commanders, standing in open hatches with excellent visibility, directed their drivers through the chaos
with a clarity the German commanders, peering through narrow vision slits, could not match. And when the range closed to where the 75mm gun became effective, Sherman crews opened fire with a volume the German forces had not anticipated. The powered turret traverse made an astonishing difference in combat. A German Panzer IV crew, rotating their turret manually, needed precious seconds to track a moving target. A Sherman gunner could keep his sights on a target while the tank maneuvered, adjusting aim with small movements of his control. This advantage became decisive in the swirling, close-range engagements that characterized the Kursk counteroffensive. German tanks found themselves flanked, surrounded, engaged from multiple directions simultaneously. A Sherman might lack the armor to survive a direct hit from a Tiger's 88mm gun, but if 3 Shermans attacked that Tiger from different angles, one would survive long enough to land a killing shot on the Tiger's thinner side armor. This was the arithmetic Soviet commanders had embraced: trade 3 tanks for 1 Tiger, and if the Tigers ran out first, victory belonged to whoever had more tanks to trade. German after-action reports from Kursk reflected a growing unease. Crews reported encountering a new type of Soviet tank, taller than the T-34 but more mobile than the KV series, equipped with what appeared to be American-style features. Intelligence officers scrambled to identify the threat, eventually recognizing the Sherman from captured documents and prisoner interrogations. The realization that the Soviet Union was fielding American equipment in significant numbers sent shockwaves through German high command. Lend-Lease, the program through which the United States supplied war material to its allies, had been dismissed by many German planners as militarily insignificant. The Soviets, according to German propaganda, were barely capable of feeding their own population, let alone absorbing and effectively deploying advanced foreign equipment. Kursk proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. The battle ended in mid-July with the German offensive shattered. Both sides suffered immense casualties, but Germany could not afford the losses. Hundreds of panzers lay wrecked across the steppe, their crews dead or captured, their replacement impossible given Germany's overstretched industrial base. Soviet losses were numerically higher, but the Red Army's tank parks were being replenished not only by Soviet factories, but by convoys arriving from American ports. Every Sherman that reached the front represented a tank Germany could not destroy through attrition. The strategic implications were clear. Germany was losing the ability to dictate the terms of engagement on the Eastern Front. The Sherman's reputation among Soviet crews solidified in the months following Kursk. Tankers gave it nicknames that reflected both affection and respect. Some called it the MCHA, a phonetic rendering of M4. Others used simpler terms, the American or the diesel, distinguishing it from the gasoline-powered versions they had heard about. But the most telling nickname was the one that spread among infantry who fought alongside these tanks. They called it the Survivor, because crews who transferred from T-34s to Shermans came back from battles alive more often than their comrades in Soviet machines. This was not a reflection of cowardice, but of engineering. The Sherman's escape hatches, its wet ammunition storage, its ergonomic interior layout all contributed to a higher crew survival rate that Soviet tankers learned to value above abstract measures like armor thickness or gun caliber. German intelligence worked frantically to assess the threat. Captured Shermans were transported to testing grounds where engineers measured armor thickness, tested gun penetration, and evaluated mechanical systems. The findings were mixed. The frontal armor, at 51 millimeters on the hull and 76 millimeters on the turret front, was not impressive by German standards. A Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's
Frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The Panther's long-barreled 75mm gun was similarly effective. Even the upgraded Panzer IV could achieve frontal penetrations at combat ranges. On paper, the Sherman should have been easy prey. Yet, battlefield results told a different story. German crews were not encountering Shermans in isolation, or at ranges where German gunnery superiority mattered. They were encountering them in masses, at close range, often from ambush positions where the first shot decided the engagement. The Soviets had learned to employ the Sherman in ways that maximized its strengths and minimized its weaknesses. Reconnaissance units used Shermans because their speed and reliability made them excellent for probing German positions. Exploitation forces used them to race through breakthroughs, bypassing strong points and driving deep into German rear areas to sow chaos. Urban combat units valued the Sherman's gun depression, which allowed it to engage targets from behind rubble and wrecked buildings more effectively than T-34s. Tank destroyer regiments used Shermans in ambush tactics, waiting in concealed positions until German armor approached and then unleashing massed fire from the flank. In every role, Soviet commanders adapted their tactics to the machine rather than forcing the machine to fit preconceived doctrine. The psychological impact on German forces grew with each encounter. Panzer crews who had grown confident in their technological superiority found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The sight of a formation of Shermans advancing across open ground, turrets traversing smoothly, guns firing on the move, provoked a dread that no amount of training could suppress. Radio intercepts captured desperate transmissions from German units requesting permission to withdraw rather than engage. Orders from high command became increasingly explicit. Do not engage Soviet armor unless you possess overwhelming advantage in position or numbers. Avoid close-range combat. Prioritize survival of the crew and vehicle over glory.
These were not the orders of a confident army. These were the orders of a force that had learned to fear. The winter of 1943 brought new horrors for German forces. Soviet offensives rolled westward, liberating territory with a speed that left German commanders reeling. The Shermans proved their worth in conditions that immobilized heavier German tanks. Mud and snow that bogged down Tigers and Panthers were merely obstacles for the Shermans' wide tracks and reliable engine. Soviet crews pushed their machines relentlessly, advancing through blizzards and across frozen rivers, maintaining pressure that never allowed German forces to establish stable defensive lines. Maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping the Shermans operational despite sub-zero temperatures and constant combat. The simplicity of the design paid dividends. A broken track could be replaced in hours. Engine maintenance required only basic tools. Spare parts, when they arrived, fit perfectly because every Sherman was built to the same exacting standards. German tank production, by contrast, was a nightmare of complexity. The Tiger, magnificent though it was, required hundreds of hours of skilled labor to produce. Each machine was hand-fitted, making spare parts non-interchangeable between vehicles. The Panther, rushed into production before its design was mature, suffered from chronic mechanical failures that left entire battalions immobilized. German industry was producing quality over quantity, a strategy that worked when each German tank could destroy multiple enemy tanks. But when the enemy arrived in endless waves, when every destroyed Sherman was replaced by two more, when the Americans were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, quality became irrelevant. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could afford to lose. By 1944, the Shermans' presence on the Eastern Front had become ubiquitous. Over 4,000 served in Soviet tank and mechanized corps, representing a
significant fraction of Soviet armored strength. These machines participated in every major offensive, from the liberation of Ukraine through the drive into Poland, and ultimately the assault on Germany itself. They were present at the Dnieper crossings, where Soviet forces stormed across one of Europe's greatest rivers under fire. They fought in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, encircling and destroying an entire German corps. They led the charge into the Balkans, liberating Romania and Bulgaria. And they rolled through the ruins of East Prussia, bringing the war back to German soil. The crews who manned these machines became veterans, survivors of battles that consumed entire generations. They learned every quirk of their American tanks, how the engine sounded when it needed maintenance, how the transmission shifted most smoothly, how to angle the armor to maximize protection. They painted kill rings on their gun barrels, each ring representing a destroyed German tank. They gave their tanks names, sometimes patriotic, sometimes profane, always personal. These were not just machines, they were partners in survival, steel cocoons that had brought them through hell and might, if luck held, bring them home. German forces continued to fight with skill and determination, but the strategic situation was hopeless. Every retreat left behind equipment that could not be replaced. Every counterattack consumed reserves that did not exist. And always, pressing from the east, came the endless columns of Soviet armor, the olive-drab Shermans rolling alongside the angular T-34s, a symbol of the alliance that was crushing the Third Reich between hammer and anvil. German soldiers who glimpsed these formations on the horizon knew what was coming, not just defeat, but annihilation. The Green Devil was not a single tank. It was the manifestation of an industrial and military alliance that Germany could never match. And its approach signaled the end of all things. The human cost of the Shermans' effectiveness became apparent not in the machines destroyed, but in the lives consumed by the relentless advance westward. Soviet crews who climbed into these American tanks understood that survival was statistical rather than guaranteed. Each battle reduced the odds. Each engagement brought them closer to the moment when luck would fail and steel would not be enough. The spacious interior that seemed so comfortable in training became a trap when shells began flying. The wet stowage system reduced the chance of catastrophic ammunition detonation, but it did not eliminate it. A hit in the wrong place still meant fire, still meant screaming, still meant the desperate scramble for hatches that might be jammed or blocked by debris. Vasily Kruchenko commanded a Sherman in the 3rd Guards Tank Army during the push through Byelorussia in the summer of 1944. His crew had survived Kursk, had fought through the liberation of Kiev, had crossed the Dnieper under artillery fire that turned the river into a cauldron of explosions. They had named their tank Patriot and painted a red star on the turret so large that German gunners could spot it from kilometers away. Kruchenko considered this good luck. If the enemy was aiming at his tank, they were not aiming at someone else. His crew trusted him absolutely. The driver, a Ukrainian farmer who had learned to operate the Sherman's controls with the same intuitive understanding he had once applied to tractors, could thread the tank through terrain that would bog down less skilled operators. The gunner, a former factory worker from Leningrad, had developed an almost supernatural ability to judge distance and lead moving targets. The loader, barely 19, worked with manic efficiency, slamming shells into the breach with a rhythm that never faltered, even under fire.
Of every tank crew. The plan called for a rapid assault supported by artillery and infantry, overwhelming the defenses before they could organize effective resistance. Kruchenko's company would lead the advance, exploiting any breakthrough to race into the town and secure key intersections. It was a standard operation, the kind they had executed dozens of times. There was no reason to expect this time would be different. The artillery barrage began at dawn, shells screaming overhead to impact against German positions with thunderous detonations. Smoke and dust obscured the horizon. Kruchenko stood in his commander's hatch, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning for targets. The radio crackled with traffic as other commanders reported their readiness. The infantry huddled behind the tanks, waiting for the order to advance. And then the barrage lifted, and the order came, and Patriot surged forward with the rest of the company. Tracks biting into the earth, engine roaring, gun elevated and ready. They made it 300 meters before the ambush was sprung. Anti-tank guns positioned in the rubble of demolished buildings opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes betraying positions that had been invisible moments before. The tank to Kruchenko's left exploded, its turret lifting into the air on a column of flame. Another tank slewed sideways, tracks severed, crew bailing out into a hail of machine gun fire. Kruchenko screamed orders to his driver, directing him toward cover while his gunner traversed the turret toward the nearest gun position. The 75mm barked, the recoil rocking the tank, and the anti-tank gun disappeared in a cloud of smoke and shrapnel. But there were more guns, more flashes, more incoming rounds that shrieked past or slammed into the earth nearby. Patriot reached a depression that offered momentary shelter. Kruchenko assessed the situation with the cold calculation that separated veterans from corpses. Half the company was gone, burning wrecks scattered across the approach. The Germans had positioned their defenses perfectly, overlapping fields of fire that covered every avenue of advance. Frontal assault was suicide. But the mission demanded that they push forward, that they break through regardless of cost. This was the arithmetic Soviet commanders had embraced, and Kruchenko had long since stopped questioning it. He ordered his driver to advance along a route that would use terrain features for cover, gambling that speed and maneuver could get them close enough to suppress the anti-tank guns with machine gun fire. They almost made it. The Sherman crested a small rise, and for a moment Kruchenko saw the town spread before them, buildings shattered but still recognizable, streets choked with rubble, and somewhere in that maze, the German defenders waiting with weapons that could kill his tank at point-blank range. Then something struck Patriot's right side with the sound like a cathedral bell being struck by a sledgehammer. The interior filled with smoke and the screech of tortured metal. The driver slumped forward, dead before he could scream. The loader clutched at his face where shrapnel had torn through flesh. Kruchenko felt something hot and wet running down his leg, but felt no pain, not yet, the adrenaline and shock combining to insulate him from the damage his body had sustained.
The gunner was still alive, still functional, and with hands that moved on instinct, he traversed the turret toward where the shot must have originated. Krutchenko saw it too. A German tank destroyer partially concealed behind a collapsed wall, its long gun already reloading for another shot. The Sherman 75mm spoke first, the shell striking the destroyer's front armor and ricocheted into the sky. Not enough penetration. The range was too great, the angle wrong. The German crew would not miss twice. Krutchenko knew this with absolute certainty. He made the only choice available. He ordered his surviving crew to bail out. The gunner went first, dropping through the floor hatch and sprinting toward the nearest crater. The loader followed, his face a mask of blood, stumbling but moving. Krutchenko pulled himself from the commander's hatch, his wounded legs screaming now, the pain arriving all at once. He fell more than climbed from the tank, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Behind him, Patriot shuddered as the German destroyer's second shot punched through the turret ring. The wet stowage system did its job. There was no catastrophic explosion, no fireball that would have incinerated anyone still inside. Just smoke and the hiss of escaping fluids and the metallic groan of a machine dying. Krutchenko crawled toward cover, dragging his useless leg, waiting for the machine gun burst that would end him. It never came. Soviet infantry were pouring through gaps in the German line, overwhelming positions that had been focused on engaging armor. The German destroyer reversed out of its position, retreating before it could be swarmed. Within an hour, Bobruisk was in Soviet hands. Krutchenko was evacuated to a field hospital where a surgeon removed shrapnel from his thigh and told him he would walk again, given time. His gunner survived with minor wounds. The loader lost an eye but lived. The driver was buried in a mass grave with 24 other tankers who had died in the assault. Krutchenko returned to duty 6 weeks later, assigned to a new Sherman with a new crew. They did not name this tank. Names implied attachment, and attachment was dangerous when life expectancy could be measured in days. He led this crew through Poland, through the crossing of the Vistula, through the bloody fighting in East Prussia, where German civilians and soldiers fought with equal desperation. He survived to see Berlin, to watch Soviet artillery reduce the capital of the Third Reich to rebel, to park his Sherman in front of the Reichstag, while infantrymen raised the red banner on its roof. Of the 12 men who had crewed Shermans in his original company at Kursk, he was the only one who lived to see victory. Stories like Krutchenko's multiplied across thousands of crews and hundreds of battles. The Sherman kept them alive longer than Soviet tanks might have, but longer was relative. The arithmetic of attrition consumed everyone eventually. Soviet records, fragmentary and often deliberately obscured, suggest that crew casualties in Sherman units were marginally lower than in T-34 units, perhaps 15 to 20% better survival rates. This translated to thousands of men who came home when they otherwise would not have. But it also meant that the majority still died, still burned, still screamed their last breaths inside steel coffins that had promised protection but delivered only a slightly better chance. The children and old men who appeared in the final months of the war did not fight from Shermans, they fought against them. German boys conscripted into the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth found themselves armed with Panzerfausts and placed in positions where Soviet tanks would advance. The propaganda told them they were defending the fatherland, that one boy with courage could stop a tank, that their sacrifice would be remembered as heroism. The reality was butchery. Soviet crews, hardened by years of combat and knowing that the war was nearly won, showed no mercy to those who raised weapons against them. A boy stepping from a doorway with a Panzerfaust on his shoulder was cut down by machine gun fire before he could aim. An old man who managed to fire his weapon and destroy a Sherman was hunted through rebel by vengeful infantry who showed him the same consideration German forces had shown Soviet civilians. The city of Breslau became a particular nightmare in early 1945. Declared a fortress city by Hitler, its garrison was ordered to resist to the last. Soviet forces surrounded it and began a methodical reduction that lasted months. Shermans participated in the siege, their guns used to blast holes in buildings, their machine guns suppressing German snipers and Panzerfaust teams. The civilian population, trapped inside the collapsing perimeter, suffered terribly. Food ran out, water became
scarce. Disease spread through crowded shelters. And still the garrison fought, throwing children and old men into defensive positions while the Shermans ground ever closer. One incident captured the grotesque futility of the final resistance. A 14-year-old boy named Hans, whose father had died at Stalingrad and whose mother had perished in an air raid, was handed a Panzerfaust by an SS officer and told to defend a barricade near the train station. Hans had never fired a weapon. He had been a student, interested in mathematics and music, planning to attend university when the war ended. That future had been stolen by forces he did not understand, and now he stood in the ruins of his city with a weapon he barely knew how to use, waiting for tanks that would not show mercy. The Shermans came at dusk, 3 of them moving in mutual support, their commanders coordinating by radio, their tactics refined by years of urban combat. They saw the barricade, identified it as a likely ambush position, and saturated it with machine gun fire before approaching. Hans crouched behind rubble, the Panzerfaust heavy in his trembling hands, praying for courage or death or both. When the lead Sherman passed his position, close enough that he could have touched its hull, he stood and raised the weapon. His hands shook too badly to aim properly. The trigger mechanism confused him. He fumbled with it for seconds that felt like hours. The Panzerfaust fired, the warhead streaking away at an angle that missed the Sherman by meters. The backblast scorched the wall behind him. And then the Sherman's turret rotated with mechanical precision, and the coaxial machine gun found him. And Hans died without understanding why any of this had been necessary. Soviet infantry found his body and the unfired Panzerfaust stacked near the barricade. They did not know his name, or his age, or his story. He was simply another enemy combatant, another casualty in a war that had consumed tens of millions. The Sherman he had tried to destroy continued advancing, its crew unaware that they had killed a child, grinding through the city until Breslau finally surrendered in May, days after Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender. These final battles revealed the ultimate truth about armored warfare. Tanks did not win wars. They facilitated victories. They broke through defensive lines. They supported infantry and terrified enemies. But the human cost of deploying them, of crewing them, of fighting against them, was always higher than the strategic value they provided. The Sherman had given Soviet forces a tool that enhanced their effectiveness, that improved crew survivability, that contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. But it had not made war less brutal or less consuming. It had merely changed the efficiency with which lives could be spent in pursuit of military objectives. The aftermath of the war found thousands of Shermans scattered across Eastern Europe, some still operational, most damaged or destroyed. Soviet forces began the process of cataloging and recovering equipment. Shermans in good condition were shipped back to the Soviet Union, refurbished and placed in reserve units. Others were cannibalized for spare parts. Many were simply abandoned where they stood, left to rust in fields and forests, monuments to a conflict that had reshaped the world. The lessons learned from Sherman operations influenced Soviet tank design for decades. Engineers studied the features that had made it effective. The powered turret traverse became standard in Soviet designs. The emphasis on crew survivability, once considered secondary to offensive capability, was integrated into new models. The T-44 and later the T-54 incorporated ergonomic improvements directly inspired by examining captured and Lend-Lease vehicles. Soviet doctrine evolved as well, retaining the emphasis on mass and momentum, but adding sophistication in communications, logistics, and combined arms coordination. Western nations drew their own conclusions. American tankers who fought Shermans in Korea against Soviet-supplied T-34s
gained a respect for the machines they had once criticized. The Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance proved decisive in a conflict where supply lines stretched across oceans. British and Canadian forces, who had fielded Shermans throughout the war, continued using them into the 1950s, testament to the design's fundamental soundness. Even nations that had fought against Germany began acquiring surplus Shermans, recognizing that the combination of availability, reliability, and combat effectiveness made them valuable despite their obsolescence. The Cold War transformed the Sherman's legacy. Surplus vehicles were sold or gifted to allied nations around the world. Israel used Shermans extensively in its early conflicts, modifying them with more powerful guns and engines. The Sherman fought in South America, in Asia, in Africa. Each deployment proved that the basic design remained viable decades after its initial production. The tank that German crews had learned to fear on the Eastern Front became a symbol of American industrial might and a tool of Cold War foreign policy. In museums today, Shermans stand carefully preserved, their olive drab paint restored, their markings replicated from historical photographs. Plaques explain their technical specifications and their role in various campaigns. Visitors walk around them, taking photographs, marveling at the size and complexity. But these museum pieces cannot convey the reality of what it meant to crew one in combat. They cannot replicate the sound of the engine, the smell of gun smoke and diesel fumes, the claustrophobic heat of the interior, the terror of incoming fire. They are monuments, not memories. Veterans who survived the war rarely spoke of their experiences. The men who crewed Shermans on the Eastern Front returned home to a Soviet Union that did not acknowledge the contribution of Lend-Lease equipment. Official histories emphasized Soviet production and Soviet heroism, minimizing or ignoring the role of American and British supplies. Tank crews who had survived because of Sherman reliability, who had won battles because of superior optics and powered turrets, were told that victory had been achieved through Soviet strength alone. Many accepted this narrative, exhausted by war and unwilling to challenge official doctrine. Others remained silent, knowing that their truth was unwelcome. Khrushchenko lived until 1987, working as a school teacher in a small town in Ukraine. He never spoke publicly about his war service. His students knew only that he walked with a limp and that sometimes, during thunderstorms, he would pause mid-sentence and stare out the window with an expression they could not interpret. When he died, his family found a box of photographs hidden in his closet. Pictures of young men in tanker uniforms, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the forced cheer of those who knew they might not survive the next battle. A faded unit patch from the 3rd Guards Tank Army. A fragment of metal, polished smooth by decades of handling, that might have been a piece of shrapnel removed from his leg or a souvenir from Patriot's wreckage. His children did not know the stories behind these objects. The stories had died with him. The Sherman that Soviet forces called the Green Devil, that German crews learned to fear, that enabled the Red Army's drive to Berlin, was ultimately just a machine. Steel and aluminum and rubber assembled in factories by workers who never saw combat, shipped across oceans by sailors who faced their own dangers, delivered to crews who climbed inside knowing their survival was never guaranteed. Its technical features mattered. Its reliability mattered. Its contribution to Allied victory mattered. But what mattered most, what defined its legacy beyond statistics and specifications, was the human experience of those who fought in it and against it. Technology in warfare is always a multiplier of human effort and human sacrifice. The Sherman multiplied Soviet offensive capability, enabling breakthroughs that might otherwise have been impossible.
Stalled, providing crews with a better chance of survival than domestic designs offered. But it also multiplied the cost, because every advance enabled by better equipment meant pushing deeper into enemy territory, engaging in more battles,
accepting more casualties in pursuit of victory. The machine did not reduce the human price of war. It merely changed how that price was paid and who paid it. German soldiers who faced Sherman-equipped Soviet units in the final year of the war experienced the terror of being overwhelmed by an enemy whose industrial capacity they could not match. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced. Every dead crew was replaced. The Soviet advance was relentless not because Soviet soldiers were superhuman, but because the alliance supplying them had resources Germany could never equal. The Shermans symbolized this imbalance, this industrial and economic reality that no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome. German veterans who survived the war and spoke of their experiences often mentioned the moment they realized defeat was inevitable. For many, that moment came when they saw the endless columns of American-supplied vehicles rolling east, the visible proof that Germany was fighting not just the Soviet Union, but the combined might of nations whose factories outproduced the Third Reich by orders of magnitude. The question of whether the Sherman was a triumph or a tragedy admits no simple answer. For Soviet crews, it was both, a machine that gave them better odds of survival, but still consumed them in numbers that defy comprehension. For German soldiers, it was the embodiment of their nation's strategic failure, a weapon system they could destroy individually, but never defeat collectively. For the Allies who produced it, the Sherman was a compromise, a tank that was good enough when produced in sufficient quantities to overwhelm enemies with superior individual vehicles. For historians, it represents the industrialization of warfare, the moment when victory became determined not by the quality of weapons, but by the capacity to produce and deploy them in overwhelming numbers. What remains in the historical record are numbers that cannot fully convey reality. Over 4,000 Shermans delivered to the Soviet Union, thousands more destroyed in combat, tens of thousands of crew casualties across all nations that fielded the type. Millions of rounds fired, thousands of enemy vehicles destroyed. These statistics describe the scope, but not the experience. They quantified the result, but not the human cost. The legacy of the Sherman in Soviet service is preserved in archives, in the journals of military historians, in the fading memories of the few veterans who survived long enough to share their stories. It is preserved in the wreckage that still emerges from Eastern European fields when construction crews dig foundations, rusted hulls that once protected men now long dead. It is preserved in the design of every subsequent tank that incorporated lessons learned from its deployment, in the doctrinal manuals that studied its effectiveness, in the Cold War strategies that assumed future conflicts would be decided by the same arithmetic of attrition that characterized World War II. But perhaps the truest preservation of its legacy lies in acknowledging what it represents. Not glory, not heroism, not triumph, but the brutal calculus of industrial warfare, where victory belongs to the side that can sustain losses longer than the enemy can inflict them. The Sherman enabled the Soviet Union to sustain those losses while maintaining offensive momentum. It gave individual crews a better chance to survive individual battles. But it did not and could not eliminate the fundamental truth that armored warfare consumes the lives of those who wage it, that every advance is purchased with blood, and that the machines which promise victory deliver only the means to continue fighting until one side can no longer replace its losses. In the end, the Sherman that German forces could not stop was unstoppable not because it was invulnerable,
Because it was replaceable. The machine could be destroyed. The crew could be killed. But the industrial and economic systems that produced it could generate replacements faster than Germany could eliminate them. This was the lesson of the Eastern Front, the truth that no amount of tactical brilliance or technological sophistication could overcome. Victory in industrial warfare belongs not to the army with the best weapons, but to the nation with the greatest capacity to sustain losses and continue fighting. The young men who climbed into Shermans and drove them into battle against the Wehrmacht did not think in these abstract terms. They thought about surviving the next engagement, about keeping their machine running, about protecting their comrades. They performed acts of courage and skill that deserve recognition. They endured hardships that civilians cannot imagine. And when they died, as most eventually did, they left behind families who mourned them, and a historical record that reduced their sacrifice to statistics. This is what the Sherman represents. Not just a weapon system or a feat of engineering, but a chapter in the story of how industrial nations wage war, how they calculate acceptable losses, and how they spend the lives of their citizens in pursuit of strategic objectives. Understanding this does not diminish the courage of those who fought or the significance of their contribution to defeating fascism. It simply acknowledges that their courage was exploited by systems that valued victory over individual survival, and that their sacrifice was necessary because the alternative was defeat, and that the machines they trusted with their lives were tools designed not to save them, but to enable them to fight effectively until they were killed or the war ended. The Sherman remains in museums and in memory as a symbol of Allied victory in World War II. It deserves this recognition. It was an effective weapon system that contributed significantly to that victory. But it also deserves to be remembered as a machine that consumed the lives of those who crewed it and those who fought against it, a product of industrial warfare that prioritized production over protection and accepted catastrophic casualties as the price of offensive success. Both truths exist simultaneously, and neither diminishes the other. The Sherman was a triumph of engineering and industrial production. It was also an instrument of a type of warfare that measured success in enemy vehicles destroyed, while accepting that achieving those statistics required sacrificing thousands of crews. This is the complete story of the tank Germany never expected and could not stop. A machine that arrived from across the ocean, that enabled Soviet forces to maintain their westward drive, that gave crews a marginally better chance of survival, and that ultimately symbolized the industrial imbalance that doomed the Third Reich. It was feared by those who faced it, valued by those who crewed it, and studied by those who sought to learn its lessons. And when the war ended and the machines fell silent, what remained was not just victory, but the memory of all those who died to achieve it. Their lives, the true cost of the weapon that could not be stopped.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.